Ce l'ha duro! 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 Capra ignorante!
Hello guys and welcome back to the 32nd episode of Italian Politician of the Week. I am Ipernick and I make weekly videos on Italian history and politics in English. Today we're talking about Giorgio Almirante, the founder of the Italian social movement and its secretary throughout most of its history. Almirante is probably one of the most complicated episodes I've ever made, for two main reasons that I had a hard time wrapping my head around. First is definition of fascism, which is actually very different from the original doctrine. I will explain it later, although it felt very incoherent on some aspects. The other reason is not really about the topic itself, but its implications. Specifically, I wondered how a neo-fascist party like the MSI was able to survive in a country with a constitution that states it shall be forbidden to reorganize under any form whatsoever the dissolved fascist party. This is a party that to some extent still lives on today in the form of symbols and spirit. However, aside of his questionable stances, Giorgio Almirante has proven himself a man with a certain intellect, capable of understanding the flaws and faults of Mussolini's regime while also figuring out its long-term contributions to society. Without further ado, let's begin with the history of Giorgio Almirante and its creation. Giorgio Almirante was born in a small town near Parma in 1914. He came from a family of actors and writers who ultimately inspired him to graduate in literature in 1937. From a very young age, he was very conservative and so he got along very well with the fascist authorities. He will work as a journalist for the newspaper Il Tevere and Difesa della Razza, which translate to Defense of the Race, a name that not only is the least catchy bullshit I've ever heard, but is hopefully eerie. During the war, he fought in the army in the campaigns in Africa and later against the rebel forces after the armistice was signed. He got into politics in 1943 when he became a functionary for the Ministry of Culture in the Saló Republic. When the war was lost in 1944, he left the country to avoid capture, and probably his death too, since the communists were not likely to forgive him, though he came back in 1946 after all former fascists were pardoned, and it was then when he founded the Italian social movement, a party whose premise was to revive the fascist regime. Almirante was chosen as party secretary for his loyalty to the regime and its marginal role in the war, which made him virtually unrecognizable. However, in the first few years, the real leaders of the party were a set of anonymous fascists, veterans who stuck with Mussolini until the very end. I say anonymous because I couldn't find any names, which is weird but it kinda makes sense. No neo-fascist was elected to the Constitutional Assembly, so the beginnings were very rough for the MSI, and understandably so. Most of the people in parliament and outside it had fought in one way or another against the previous regime and worked their asses off to establish the republic, so you can imagine that seeing a bunch of Mussolini fanboys in the ballot and later in both chambers really triggered a lot of people. Their electorate was very slim. At first, the people who voted for them were landowners, mostly from the south, who were afraid to lose their lands from the collectivization reforms that the left wanted, alongside some people of the DC, like Antonio Segni. Another big portion of their votes came from the Catholic Church and the ultra-Catholics, who wanted Catholicism to be the state religion just like it was established in the Lateran Treaty by Mussolini in 1929. The MSI wanted Catholicism as the state religion as well, unlike everybody else, except maybe the monarchists, who wanted the state to be separate from the church. The Christian Democratic Party, contrary to what you might expect, were also in favor of this separation. For this reason, in fact, the founder Alcide de Gasperi had terrible relations with the Vatican. This is probably the biggest difference between Mussolini's or even the Nuncio's original fascist doctrine and Almirante's ideas. Fascism, just like socialism, was unreligious. The reason why Mussolini made the arrangement with the church was purely political, but the MSI changed that and were very keen in increasing the power of the church. Almirante's core beliefs were that to be fascist meant being strongly Catholic and to put your nation above all else. In fact, he was opposed to NATO and to any other democratic entity, really, including the Italian parliament, ironically enough. Before I talk about his political compass, I want to talk briefly about the moderate wing of the MSI. In 1950, people in the party thought that Almirante's positions were counterproductive due to how radical they were, and so he was substituted by Augusto de Marsanich and later Arturo Michelini, who ruled until 1969. They had different approaches. Their goal was ultimately to bring back fascism, but they intended to do so using democratic institutions, including the international ones, in a similar way to how Mussolini did it, and they almost managed it in 1960 when they took advantage of Tambroni's weak cabinet. I made a video about that already, which I will link above. The best way I can describe the Italian social movement in the 50s and 60s is shallow and toxic. They would try to force themselves in governments by using political blackmail in the form of votes of known confidence. Nobody wanted to be seen around them. They were basically the black sheep of parliament because everybody knew that if they saw even a crumb of power, they would use it to step on everyone else. The only reason why they were allowed into parliament was because of the Scelba law that was passed very early on in history of the republic. Both the left and the right had their own reasons to tolerate their presence. Nenni and Togliatti realized that without a fascist party, their seats would certainly go to the DC, and since under the MSI those seats were irrelevant, it played in their favor. On the other hand, de Gasperi, Fanfani and many others feared social repercussions for not accepting the MSI into parliament. For example, they could turn into a terrorist group and try to take over the government, something that they did anyway, so they let them stay. They also didn't mind having another anti-communist ally in parliament at the end of the day. Then in 1969, the monarchist party, which is an interesting topic on its own, became one with the Italian social movement, and this new influx allowed Almirante to come back. You know what? Now it's time to have a look at his political compass. Giorgio Almirante, unlike his moderate colleagues, had a more direct approach. Despite his authoritarian views on a lot of stuff, he supported some anti-establishment and somewhat liberal policies in his career, such as divorce and gender equality, something that may seem very odd today, but it kinda makes sense. You know what Almirante reminded me of? You wouldn't guess it. Paul Joseph Watson when he says,
"Conservatism is the new counterculture."
During the 70s and 80s, Almirante really started to look objectively at the role the party had in the republic. He probably looked at what had happened to the monarchist party and realized that if he didn't give his creation some vitality, a real change in identity, its electorate will eventually die along with it. He never denied his past. He was one of the few people that used the word fascist as a positive attribute. A fascist, as I said before, was somebody who loved his nation, had strong religious values, and saw the flaws in the democratic system that could only be resolved by the introduction of a strong leader. But he saw no strong leader around him, nobody that could compare to what Il Duce used to be, and so he gave up. Like if he came to the sudden realization that there could be no fascist regime without Mussolini, and if there was going to be a new one, he wouldn't live to see it. Up until his death in 1988, Almirante slowly yet steadily changed his party identity to something closer to national conservatism, if not liberal conservatism. He personally despised people like Craxi and probably would have hated Berlusconi too, but he wanted his party to live on on once he was gone. This worked. In fact, the MSI saw a slight increase in popularity during this time period. He chose Gianfranco Fini as his heir, a moderate national conservative who founded the National Alliance and worked with Berlusconi for many years up until 2012. Today, to carry on the torch of Almirante is Giorgia Meloni, who is far from being neo-fascist, although she seems a lot more conservative than Fini. Today, Almirante is a very controversial figure in Italy, mostly because people don't fully understand what he stood for, and that's not really their fault because it's not really simple. Some see him as an enemy of democracy, others as a fascist who repented. My personal conviction is that despite being fascist, he died believing that the Italian Republican institutions were not so bad after all, and left this world knowing that his ideas will live on and adapt on their own for many years to come. He is a humble fascist, I guess. I hope you found this video interesting. I will see you next week with a brand new politician.